from the 26th of October to the 29th of October 2021. Visit the Centre's website and social media pages to register or to find more information. Let us as stakeholders collectively
I think that was just a small teaser that we had for this particular Expo, and I thank everyone for joining us today. Let me just check with Maina before we start. Are you still leaving us in the next 1 hour?
Probably a little earlier, maybe about straight at 9, yes.
Okay, then I will start so that the rest can just join us along the way.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, fine then. Thank you very much. So good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session, which is themed Elections, Technology and Information Disorder. While very emotive subject, this theme is central to the quality of democracy globally. It goes to the heart of how we exercise our right to political participation, as well as our freedom of expression. To help us unpackage this theme, today we have a very distinguished panel, which I thank most sincerely for making time to be here today. So I'll just go straight to the bios. We have Maina Kiai. Maina Kiai is a former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. He's currently a board member of Facebook Oversight Board. He's a lawyer trained at Nairobi and Harvard University. Mr. Kiai is a longtime campaigner for human rights and constitutional reform in Kenya, notably as the founder and ED of the unofficial Kenya Human Rights Commission, and then as chairperson of Kenya National Human Rights Commission. Mr. Kiai is also a former ED of the International Council on Human Rights Policy, a Geneva-based think tank that produced research reports and briefing papers with policy recommendations. Mr. Kiai was also the director of Amnesty International African Program and the African director of the International Human Rights Law Group. He has held research fellowships at Danish Institute for Human Rights in Copenhagen, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, and the Trans-Africa Forum in Washington. Welcome, Maina. Our second presenter, we have Dr. Seema Shah. Dr. Seema Shah is the head of International IDEA Democracy Assessment Department, which produces a biannual Global State of Democracy report, and annually updated Global State of Democracy indices, and an EU co-founded COVID-19 Global Monitor on Democracy and Human Rights. She previously served as the Research and Strategy Lead for the International Rescue Committee Humanitarian Innovation Department in Middle East region, based in Amman. Prior experience also includes leading election integrity-related research and advocacy for a coalition of Kenyan civil society organizations in Nairobi. As the director of research, she managed a team of data analysts in the development of evidence-based advocacy reports for national election reform campaigns and for Supreme Court cases challenging the credibility of the 2013 and 2017 Kenyan elections. Seema has also worked on election violence, media development, campaign finance reform, and standard setting for election integrity with civil society organizations in Sri Lanka, Kenya, Zimbabwe, DRC, and the United States, as well as international IDEA in her previous capacity. She holds a PhD in political science from UCLA, where her dissertation focused on patterns of intra-ethnic election violence in Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Iraq. Welcome, Seema. Our third speaker is William Bird. William Bird studied at the University of Wits in Johannesburg, where he obtained his BA and honors degree in drama and film. He worked in television after completing his studies. Unable to resist the lure of media monitoring, William started with some part-time monitoring for Media Monitoring Project, now Media Monitoring Africa, in 1995. And after leaving television, joined MMA as a researcher. At MMA, William has overseen or been directly involved in over 100 media monitoring projects on subjects ranging from gender-based violence, HIV and racism to children and the media. William has also overseen the data analysis of the biggest civil society media monitoring exercise in the world, the Global Media Monitoring Project. William was appointed an Ashoka Fellow in 2009 and also a Link Fellow in 2010 for his work focused on children's participation in the media. In his 12 years as director of MMA, William has helped MMA grow up from a small 3-people-driven organization to a committed team of 16 people with a clear vision and dedicated program areas. William's knowledge of media monitoring and commitment to deepening democracy in South Africa and the continent has assured his expertise is internationally recognized. Thank you, William, for being here today. Last but not least, we have Ian Barber. Ian provides legal and policy advice to Global Partners Digital and his partners on human rights in the digital environment. As senior legal officer, he produces legal analysis in response to key concerns and priorities, policy briefings, and other resources for a range of stakeholders. He also supports the development of human rights-based analytical frameworks and tools on key policy issues. Prior to joining GPD, Ian worked at a number of immigration and human rights law-based firms in San Francisco Bay Area. He has also undertaken research for international lawyers and academics at the University of California and the Université Paris-Dakar. His recent publications discuss the application of international humanitarian law to emerging security issues. Ian is a New York published qualified lawyer and was admitted to practice in 2019. He holds a Juris Doctor from the University of California with a specialization in international and comparative law. He also holds a Master's of Law from SOAS, University of London, with a specialization in human rights, conflict, and justice. He previously obtained a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Political Science from McGill University. Ian is fluent in English and proficient in French and Spanish. Welcome, Ian. So I'll go straight to the questions, and I will start with Dr. Seema Shah. Looking at the issues of elections and technology, the world has seen increased reliance when it comes to technology in the administration of elections and how we exercise our freedom of expression. With reference to the Global State of Democracy report that IDEA publishes, what has been the impact that you've seen when it comes to ICTs on elections, as well as how we exercise, our freedom of expression, as well as political speech? Please just set the context for us. Over to you, Seema.
Thank you so much, Stella, and to the Center for Human Rights for this opportunity. Just briefly, I'll say that based on the research that we did for the Global State of Democracy report, it's really difficult actually to comprehensively describe the impact of ICTs on elections. In some ways, we've seen ICT being used to facilitate easier and therefore more participation in elections. For example, I think we all know the case of Estonia, which in 2005 became the first country in the world to use electronic voting for nationwide elections. In the most recent election in that country, they saved an estimated 11,000 working days by using that technology. Over the past several years, we have also seen ICTs being used to help politicians and leaders connect with their constituents. And so we're all familiar with things like live stream town hall meetings on Facebook, Twitter debates, and many more examples. At the same time, ICTs have had a particularly negative effect on electoral integrity. In Kenya, the use of biometric voter registration, for example, did not help bring clarity to elections at all. In fact, the biometric list was different from the paper list, which continued to exist. The electronic results transmission system infamously broke down in both 2013 and 2017, and no paper trails were ever made available for public scrutiny. In fact, the actual polling station level election results for both of those elections were never published and continue not to be published or made publicly available. These are just a few examples, but of course, any ICT is only ever going to be as good as the people that are using it and running it. So let's not forget that ICTs are just another tool. So the underlying system, which is made up of the laws, the infrastructure, and people with their own agendas, that doesn't change. So in certain ways, I think it's dangerous to focus too much on ICTs alone, because then we risk missing paying attention to the root causes of these problems. When it comes to freedom of expression, ICTs have also played a significant role, both in augmenting it and damaging it. As background, it's important to note that the freedom of expression has been particularly impacted during the pandemic. Our research at International IDEA show that measures that restrict this right have been the most disproportionate when compared with other restrictions, and that they are more likely to persist after the pandemic is over. This was also the aspect of democracy most at risk prior to the onset of the pandemic. 54% of countries around the world have passed laws or taken action to restrict the freedom of expression during the pandemic, often justifying these restrictions as necessary ways to combat disinformation about the virus. 44% of democracies have also restricted the freedom of expression during the pandemic. But again, what we see is that ICTs are used to further already existing trends. So what we see is not that social media tools and phones or gadgets that make communication easier and faster themselves introduce these restrictions. What we see is that virtual platforms allow many, many more people to quickly and easily see and hear largely unfiltered and unregulated information. When this information does things like incite violence or cause harm, it begins to come under questioning, and we start to think about how to regulate it. Right-wing nationalists, for example, have always existed. It's just that now they have a much more easy way to access a global microphone. So I would say that broadly, ICTs have made it easier for people to enjoy the freedom of expression, which includes the right to seek and impart information. Anyone who can access the internet can literally access anything and everything they want to know. At the same time, though, I think there hasn't been enough attention paid to how the freedom of expression is impacted by a context marked by information disorder. Can we say that we enjoy the freedom of expression and the right to information if we can't distinguish between true and false information? Is that really a fully enjoyed right? We have to think about how to frame this, I think, in the space of human rights a little bit more seriously than we have so far.
Okay, great. You've talked about framing. I like especially that you've mentioned underlying issues when you were talking about the adoption of ICTs. You talked about underlying issues. And while initially a lot of stakeholders who are pushing for election technology just pushed for it sort of as a panacea for all the problems when it comes to election-related, election challenges, the issues when it comes to election integrity, but they failed to actually look at the structural issues that were causing the problems in the first place. And I also like the fact that you've mentioned and linked it to the issue of false news and freedom of expression, how it's important in the context of an election. But just to give people, better conceptualization, when you talk about false news, a lot of concepts are used here. We have information disorder, we have false news, we have what we are trying to run away, fake news. Are you able to just provide us with a description of these concepts?
I think the most important distinction to make is between disinformation and misinformation, which are often conflated. So usually when we say disinformation, we mean information that's purposely made to be misleading or false and then disseminated. Whereas misinformation is not, it doesn't have a malicious intent. So people spread information that's false, believing that it's true or not knowing for sure, but there isn't a purposeful deceit behind it. Whereas with disinformation, there is. And then when people talk about fake news or false news, that usually refers to, posts or articles that are meant to look like legitimate, like they come from legitimate news sources, but they don't. They're just made to look that way. So it's maybe you can think of it as kind of a subset of disinformation.
Great, thank you very much for that. And I know Maina is about to leave, so I'm going to jump to Maina for the next few minutes. And thank you for introducing the issue of false news and disinformation, because a lot of times right now, when we're looking at how we exercise political speech online, we have to look at the role of social media platforms. I know Facebook has said from time to time, they're not arbiters of truth, but we can see increasingly how these platforms influence how we exercise political speech, our expression, our freedom of expression, especially during critical times such as elections. And recently, Facebook established the Facebook Oversight Board, which sometimes has been referred to the Supreme Court of Facebook to hold, to some extent, Facebook accountable. And we are very grateful to have Maina here, member of Facebook Oversight Board. And I will throw the first question to you. In terms of when you look at elections, technology, freedom of expression, what role does the Facebook Oversight Board play? And what are the implications of the role that the Facebook Oversight Board plays when it comes to how we exercise our freedom of expression? Maina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary Stella. And thank you, Seema, for that. Setting the stage, which I think was wonderful. And I can see Irene Petras is on the call. And yesterday I was on a call with her again. So it seems that this is my week of being around Irene Petras, though I can't see her either of the times. But anyway, it's good to see your name, Irene, again. There you are. Hey, good to see you. Yeah, I think the question, look, the oversight board of Facebook was created in a sense because Facebook was facing a lot of challenges in content moderation. So our role is to go through content moderation, look at complaints, and try and figure out whether posts should stay up or come down, as the process goes. So it really was a way in which Facebook was saying that they were unable to handle the content moderation themselves, and they wanted to outsource it to a group of independent people who would make decisions. Our basis is primarily on international human rights law. That's what we try and use primarily as our document, although we also look at the community standards and we look at other documents and other papers and foundational documents that are with Facebook. It is an experiment, absolutely. I think it's the first time any company of any sort has ever sought independent people. There are some people who think we're not independent enough because the way it is organized, that Facebook had to set up a trust and put some money into a trust. So some people think that then means that we're not independent. But I think our decisions so far have been very independent. I think all the members that are on this board are determined to maintain their credibility. I think the key thing for all of us is that none of us wants to mess up our credibility by being a fig leaf for Facebook. So I think there is some hope. I think, and of course, when you look at international human rights law, the freedom of expression is paramount, is a big part. And so we are constantly debating between around freedom of expression. What is the extent of it? Where do we take an American view of freedom of expression, which is very, very broad, or do we take the international human rights law view of expression, which is a bit more limited and which then includes things like hate speech and incitement in a much more stricter way than American law. So this contestation between US law and US approach, where everything is allowed, and international human rights law, which restricts some issues, is ongoing and will continue for a while, I think, until, as we go on. But there is a very strong determination among members to utilize and use international human rights law as our major framework in making decisions. So I think it's an experiment. We'll see whether it's useful in the next few years. I think it's still too early to tell whether it's a useful thing, but we're only 20, which is also very few, given the fact that Facebook has got 2 billion plus people who are members of Facebook. So we've got a long way to go. Yeah, but I think it's so far, I think in my view, it's going well.
Okay, great. From your first answer, I actually have two questions from there, because it's interesting you mentioned an issue of independence. And I think this is something that has come up with a lot of researchers in terms of independence and also enforcement. What powers do you have as a board? In terms, you've given the decision, you've given it to Facebook, to what extent are these decisions binding? And the second part of my question goes to what you've talked about, the laws, and whether to adopt the US view, and also you're looking at international law. But here we have sometimes to say, yes, the Facebook, the original country is the US, but a lot of its audience, a lot of its users are outside the US. They are in Africa, they are in India, they're in Brazil. So how do you balance this? We have the US view, which is very broad. Then you come to certain African contexts that are very restricted when it comes to limitations of freedom of expression. And then we have now the international law, which is quite broad when it comes to allowances with freedom of expression, but with some limitations. How do you balance this?
I mean, let me go to your second question first, Mary Stella, because I think it's the more interesting one. I mean, the reason why we choose international human rights law is because it applies to every country, including the US, and including Zimbabwe, and including Chad, and including Myanmar. So that's much better standard to use. And you're very right, only 15% of the users of Facebook are based in North America. Now, so the rest of the other billions of people are based outside the US, and a lot of them in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So there is that. There are some limitations because Facebook's language is English. And posts that are not in English have to be translated and have to go through these algorithms that translate and come through. So we're finding a lot more interest and complaints from within the US and Canada than we're finding from anywhere else in the world. So one of the things we're asking people to do is utilize the oversight board, look at the complaints mechanisms, use that and come through, because we would like to see a lot more. We think there's a lot more cases outside of US and a lot more interest. There should be more interest than there is at this point. So the reason why we use international human rights law is because it's a better standard than using domestic law. Now, this contestation within the board and other places between US law and the rest is a common one. It applies wherever you meet US lawyers, and the board is a diverse board. We don't have the same opinions, don't have the same backgrounds, we don't have the same nationalities. And so this is going to continue. And I think that diversity is our strength, because it means we have to do a lot of debating, a lot of persuasion, a lot of depersuasion, if you wish. And we come to compromises that we think we can all live with because they're sensible. So it's part of it. And I think that's good to have diversity as opposed to having one framework, because that's what we don't want to do in anything anyway. So I think that tension is not necessarily bad. But I think it will continue because I think Facebook, to my mind, one of the reasons why there's such an it's an American company. It's headquartered and set up in the US, so that will always continue in that sense. Your first question about enforceability, the guiding documents, our rule book, our bylaws say some of our decisions are binding on Facebook, and there's no choice. So we say, put up, and they have, restore, they have to restore, put down, they have to put down. That's clear. That's not debatable. And Facebook, to its credit, has been obeying every single decision that is binding on them. Then we have policy recommendations and other recommendations, and that goes through a process, a very transparent process, where we say we're recommending this, and Facebook says, yes, we have agreed, we will implement in the next 3 months. No, we don't think this is implementable, and you have to give reasons for not implementing it. But everything that we do in terms of decisions and recommendations is public. We've just published our transparency report for most of this year and last quarter of last year, where we're showing what we have done, what we have said, and what Facebook has responded. We believe our authority is going to be generated by the moral power that we may or may not have. So if we decline in moral power, then they can ignore us. And for many of us, if they ignore us much too long, then people might decide to leave. So they're caught in a place where Facebook wants this experiment to work, to try and show its goodwill, because it needs to, after a lot of scandals and issues that affected Facebook. And so it's in their interest to do what they are supposed to do. Now, of course, we are seeing from the Facebook papers that are coming out, and the scandals coming out, that they may have been misleading us on some things we have asked direct questions about. And these issues are going to be discussed, and we're trying to figure out with Facebook, on our own. And we're now, in fact, in the process of working along a policy advisory opinion around the issue of cross-checking. And for those who don't know, cross-checking is a system that Facebook told us is used in a small number of cases and applies to mainly political leaders, where a further check is done to make sure that the post is legitimate or not. But it's a special system for what they said was a small number of people. Turns out it was actually millions of people. And so it turns out they were not necessarily, at least from the Facebook papers, they're not necessarily being totally forthright. So we want to understand why this process is there. Why is it that some political leaders, our celebrities, are treated differently from Ian Barber? Because if Ian Barber is going to post that doesn't make sense, the algorithms will come and deal with it. But if a personality comes on, then there's a different approach to it. And we saw that one good example is the Nema example, where his posts are left on because he's a celebrity and has got millions and millions of supporters or likes or people who follow him. So these are questions that are going to be ongoing, and I think that's fine, because I think we are clear this is an ongoing process. We have to understand that I think for Facebook and Twitter and all these people, they just did not imagine, I don't think, they would become this big so soon, so fast. And a lot of it is just disorganization. A lot of it is the left hand doesn't know what's happening with the right hand. And never ever assume that these big companies are very well organized, that they run like a military. They're not like an efficient military. They're not run like a military. There's a lot of different views and contestations within them. And that's fine, I think. So there is a process where internally, we hope that our decisions and our work as oversight board helps Facebook get better organized, know how to do things better, work on its algorithms in a way that is fair to everybody. Be a company that does allow people to have a voice and a platform where they can express their legitimate, peaceful views in a manner that's not impeded. So it's about freedom of expression, but we're not also blind to the fact that it's a company and wants to make money. So how we balance those two issues is going to be constant as we go along.
Well, thank you very much, Maina, for that. You actually brought in an issue there of cross-checking, and it went to some of the criticism that we had the Facebook Oversight Board itself had given to Facebook. And the board has criticized Facebook for issues of lack of transparency, for issues of its content decision, of how these algorithms that you've mentioned are applied. And when we look at the situation that happened with the US elections and the decision that you gave the decision the other day as the board to just keep Trump's account shut down. But now, what can the board do as stakeholders to hold Facebook more accountable? And here we are just looking beyond the US. How do we now hold other contexts as stakeholders accountable, ensure that Facebook is accountable in this regard, particularly with content moderation?
A large part of it is about engagement, Mary Stella. And I think people need to engage better with both the oversight board and with Facebook itself. Now, again, like everything else, we hear complaints, people write to individual board members saying that this has happened and I can't reach anybody within Facebook itself. So people write emails, they try and make calls and nobody responds. So there's a whole issue around how Facebook, how disorganized Facebook is. And there are complaints from India to Ethiopia to Colombia to the Middle East and another place. So it's a constant challenge that Facebook needs to work on its customer service, needs to put more money, in my view, on content moderation, on human content moderation, but also customer service, just understanding that the users are not just machines and working. They are people. And so somebody's account is barred and you can't reach anybody. So that's an issue they have to deal with. But we also have to, we also as non-Americans have to go out and tell people this body exists. Let's engage it. Let's work with it. We have had very, very few cases coming out of Africa or to the oversight board, very, very few. And we need to have more of them. And I think that's an important part. So you all at University of Pretoria, you have a duty to go out using your vast reaches and vast influence everywhere to tell people to engage. And it can't just be us as oversight board doing it. It's got to be you all as well, reaching out and saying, let's test these guys and see it as a test. Test us, We might fail, we might pass, but if we're not tested, we can't get there. So the rest of the world needs to be engaging more, and we need to get out the message that this is a possibility, and we see how it can go. But look, at the end of the day, this is a company. It's a company that needs people engaging with the platforms for it to be relevant. So every one of us, those 3 billion people, 4 billion people who engage on Facebook are powerful if they could harness that power. They can make Facebook the company that it needs to be. And that's part of the, even though, oftentimes we think they're doing us a favor, but never forget, we as the customers are the ones doing them a favor, and we've got to harness that power. So I like to see this oversight board as simply a little part of the equation that then leads to all of us looking at it as corporate accountability. Mm-hmm. These corporates are massive. These corporates are powerful. They generate more income than many countries do in Africa and other parts of the world. They are behemoths. How do we then control them? How do we hold them accountable? Those are questions we have to keep asking ourselves. So it's not just about I think that number of issues that are there, and we have to deal with them all very holistically, in my view.
Thank you very much for that. And actually, interestingly, the session that we had in the morning, we actually did it in collaboration with Facebook. And Good. So to some extent, I can say that Facebook does when we look for opportunities to partner to talk about these issues, sometimes they're a bit open as compared to other companies. For example, TikTok, which even though they are causing issues around the issue of freedom of expression, they are not quite easy to engage with. To some extent, Facebook does allow for opportunities for engagement. It's just, we are yet to see how that will pan out eventually. And it's interesting.
And remember, Mary Stella, that Facebook's change of approach is because people got really mad with how they handled Myanmar and Burma. Mm-hmm. That was where it all started, and a lot of that pressure came from then. There are lots of reports that link Facebook posts to the genocide that's happened against the Rohingyas. So these things are interrelated. So people's anger and their engagement help. So even TikTok and all these others, we've got to figure out a way to engage them in the same way.
We are trying at that. We are trying very hard, trust me. And I would encourage anybody else to ask any question to Maina before he leaves. I see Sima has a question there.
I don't have a question. I had a comment. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
I mean, to respond to what Maina said about holding them accountable, I think there are lots of really interesting ideas that people have put forth about, for instance, treating Facebook and other companies like Facebook as a utility. So accept that they have a natural monopoly over this share of the market, and therefore there are bigger responsibilities when it comes to transparency and accountability. But I think aside from that argument, I don't think we can put all the onus on the companies to be more accountable. Absolutely, they need to be accountable, but so much of what drives this is human behavior, how the users use the platform. And now there are all these really insightful studies about how so much of about the psychology behind why people share certain kinds of stories, why they believe certain kinds of stories. And there's all kinds of evidence of how you can modify your behavior with very simple interventions. For instance, one recent study showed that if people are asked to rate the likelihood that a certain story that they're seeing is true, they're less likely to go ahead and share that story if they take a minute to think and realize this is probably not completely a true story, or this is what's the word, like a fake news, or like a tabloid, right? We have learned through socialization and education how to tell the difference between a tabloid and a newspaper, for instance, right? So by implementing behavior modification sort of tactics, we could also socialize to learn how to tell the difference between real and fake news stories as well. So I think we have to think about the user side as well, not just the company side.
Maristella, I would be a little hesitant to put responsibility on users, because when you have companies that
sorry about that. Yes.
I'll be hesitant to put the onus on users so much. And I think for me and part of it is that, these companies have these algorithms that promote and push echo chambers into what, if you look at something on YouTube, then YouTube comes up with this huge recommendations that then drive you into an echo chamber. So sometimes we just get warped into that. So I think I appreciate what Seema said about the responsibility each one of us has got. But I think that we also need to look at the power dynamics between individuals and the company in terms of how we do things. But that's just my own socialization as a person who looks at things from a power dynamic more often than anything else. But that said, I think the part that I think all of us should worry about is that if these companies are not able to even make some movement into self-control and self-accountability, then the likelihood of authoritarian states, autocratic states doing something is very high. So at some point, we have to come up and figure out what is the best way of having standards, regulation at a global level that respect human rights to regulate these companies. Because yes, they are utilities in a significant way. But if we let Russia be the one to regulate these things, we are going back to the same old days of censorship, and we just got to be careful. So we are in this constant push and pull between freedom of expression and maintaining it, and also then a fear of censorship on the other hand. So we've got to find that balance carefully. But let's make no mistake. These are companies, these are corporates. And it's like, and I think just like the way we're pushing oil companies now to move away from using oil. And so yes, one way is for us as users to say, I will not drive a diesel car anymore. I'll drive a hybrid car myself because I have a responsibility. But I think the broader problem is really how these companies go on and manipulate and use us and be able to move it. But that's it.
That's it. As a final question, just so that I can move to the others, and also I can let you go as soon as you're ready to go. I think you call this an experiment. You've also mentioned how you're dealing with different contexts, although right now you've not received a lot of applications from outside the US. But now with a group of 20 people and you're dealing with different contexts, different languages, how do you understand all these contexts, all these languages as 20 people and ensure that whatever you've kept up, whatever you've, because there's a lot of weight on your shoulders here, what you've taken down, what you've kept up is actually in realization, it realizes the context that you're dealing with.
Well, we have to, just like any, and I hate to use this example, but like any arbiter around this, we try and select the cases quite carefully, hoping they'll have an impact. So we're looking for impactful cases. And the idea is that once we have one case, it can be replicated and multiplied in terms of impact across many other cases. So that's what we try and do, and whether we're successful or not. And then we also try and select cases that have diversity or things that are important, so we have got all these things now. So we have our own selection approach, but we also take up cases that Facebook sends to us. So like the Donald Trump case was sent to us by Facebook. They asked us to help them make a decision. And when that happens, we do it because it has impact. It's Donald Trump with millions and millions of people who follow him. So those kinds of cases are important. So that's how we do it. Now, but behind, of course, like everything else, behind it all, we have a group of fascinating, smart, dedicated staff who go through these things. The staff is growing. It's called the OSB administration. They are growing. They're fantastic. They research. They are full time. And like us, as the board, we spend. I think we are supposed to spend average 15 hours a month on working around these issues. So the staff are full time. They do all the work, and that's the ones who make us move. We hire companies that help us, look at the context, do translations that are necessary. So we check the translation with companies that have got translators in the country. So something is in Zulu, for example, posted in Zulu, we'll have some group that now understands Zulu, translate that for us as closely as possible. It's then counter-checked. So we're trying to do this as best as we can. It's as you can hear, anytime you go into translation, you go into context research, you go into all those things, then you have to spend a lot of money. So those people who think that the oversight board members are raking it in. Actually, a lot of those funds are going to the staff and the work that needs to be done around it. And I think that's important. I mean, we are also trying to increase the board, numbers of the board from the current 20, hopefully eventually to about 40, so we can be able to move faster and do more. So all these things are moving on as they're going. But yeah, as I said, it's an experiment and we will see where it goes. And hopefully it will be successful, hopefully be successful and see where there can be an example to TikTok and Twitter and the rest and YouTube as they move and think about how to provide openness with sanity on their platforms.
Great. Thank you very much, Maina. Any last words before I bid you adieu?
No, I just want to say thank you. And I hope that you all there at University of Pretoria and your vast network of supporters will be able to keep doing this. I think it's great to engage at this, with universities and people on these issues. I think, look, Africa is not as technologically spread out as many parts of the world, but we have got this ICTs are with us and are going to be with us for a very long time, and they are the new way. I've got to say something. I think just one thing is that partly why there's so much confusion around Twitter and Facebook and them is that these things are done very individually. Social media has made us very individualistic. You sit by your phone or your laptop and you read something and send a response, I like or I don't like. Previously, we sat around for those of you who are drinkers, had sat at a bar and had discussions and discussed it, or a restaurant and discussed it, or those who are members of unions would sit there. And so there's much more socialization and therefore filtering and cross-influencing that went around. People went to church, to mosque, and they had all these discussions. So as we have become more and more individualized because of technology, perhaps, we don't have those sounding boards that we used to have before. And you sit and think, look, even this kind of a conference we're doing, everybody's by themselves listening and making their own decisions. Had we been in an IRL conference, which you should do next year, University of Pretoria, then we can sit back and share ideas and sit back and I can ask Ian what he thinks and what does he think, thereafter with ease. But when you're doing this thing online like this, we're all in our own echo chambers. Each of us talks to ourselves and we like the sound of our own voices and say, yes, it's great. So you've got to find a way to relate better and more as human beings. That's all I gotta say. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Maina. Thank you very much for agreeing to be here. And thank you very much for always engaging. Thank you very much. And I think now, because of time, I'll have to move on to the next question and the next presenters. And this one, again, I will pose first to Sima in terms of, Maina has even mentioned in terms of the different contexts, the different approaches we see from African countries and from across the world. There's this balance that we are trying to achieve when it comes to how we exercise freedom of expression and how to limit harmful content online, especially disinformation that you first mentioned. But when we consider certain pushbacks from government, for example, Facebook tried to take down, it actually did take down some accounts of Ugandan politicians that were pro-government that were accused of manipulating voters. Uganda government proceeded to ban Facebook in Uganda. Twitter took down the post for the president of Nigeria that was supposedly, I think, advocating for violence, and Twitter was eventually banned. In Nigeria, it's still banned, and the case is in court right now. So how do we achieve this balance and see we do it in such a way that would not have such negative approaches from government and responses from government? Over to you, Sima.
And that's a very big question, which I don't think I can answer, but I can say that.
You can always rope in Ian and William here because they're coming in soon.
Good. What I can say is that what we've seen is that the large majority of efforts that have been made to help in this area have been around fact checking. So you have lots of CSOs or other organizations or groups of citizens that just come together and provide fact-checking services for some of the most widely shared fake stories or disinformation, articles that are out there. But of course, that only goes so far, right? You can only fact-check so many stories with a limited number of people, and then the people that are looking at the fact-checking information are not necessarily the people who need to be looking at it. We've also seen sort of public education campaigns, which try and teach people how to tell the difference between true stories and fake news. There's a lot of money going into better digital literacy, which I think probably needs to be integrated into curricula, schools, so that we learn from an early age what this means and how to understand it and how to differentiate. But I think one of the things that, if we go back to talking about the responsibility being on the part of the firms to do something about this, I think for me, one of the key things is that it comes back down to the algorithms and how they're designed. And because the algorithms right now, as far as we know, are designed around popularity. So if a story is popular, it's more likely to be present in your feed or whatever it is. And then when you see that more people have engaged with that story, you are more likely to share that story. But what the evidence shows is that popularity bias actually decreases the level, the quality of content. And so it is that wisdom of the crowds theory doesn't work in the digital space, because we can't make the same assumptions that we can make in real life. If you see a crowd of people running away and there's smoke in the background, it makes sense to follow the crowd and run away. But that doesn't work in the digital space because people don't always have enough information to be able to make a sound judgment about a story. And so things get popular without necessarily being true or useful or, whatever it is. And so I think there's only so much intervention we can do unless without the algorithm itself being addressed. And at the very least, being transparent about how your algorithm is designed.
That is true. And I think this even gets worse when you start looking at issues of amplification using bots or people who have been hired to amplify certain posts.
Yes.
It now becomes a whole complicated web.
And so people have suggested things like, integrating a fee structure into high frequency engagement. So if you're a bot and you're spreading millions of stories at the same time, if there's a feature which requires a fee to do that, that could mitigate some of it, or integrating more of those CAPTCHA tests, where you have to prove that you're a human before you can share on this sort of large scale. And that might mitigate the spread of some of this disinformation as well. But yeah, I think it's going to have to be a combination of those kinds of interventions and public education. And then I think really getting to the heart of the issue, which I think is the algorithm.
Great. And even looking into intervention, you've given me at least an opening point to rope in William Bird here as well as Ian later, because there are certain interventions that have come in different ways here. And for William, we have the Real 411 platform, which in its way is an intervention when it comes to countering disinformation. Could you please tell us more about what is the Real 411 platform?
Hi, good afternoon. It's been fascinating. Thanks so much. And thanks to Center for Human Rights. It's been a fabulous event. So Real 411, I guess just before I go into what it is just to kind of feed into that kind of response. I think that in the same way as we're going to need different levels of responses, we also need a multi-stakeholder approach to deal with these responses. We cannot leave this to the platforms. They don't have an interest fundamentally in addressing this. The only time, as Mina said, Facebook moved because people got angry. They didn't move because they saw it was the right thing to do, because they're companies. They don't have a vested interest in democracy. They don't understand what democracy is because they're a company, right? So you have to work with them because of their role that they play, in the same way as you had to regulate big oil and all of these big other companies. When they come in and they behave in the way that they have, there's certain things that you've got to do. What is so worrying about where we are now is the over temptation by many states to just say, okay, well, we're going to just decide on how to do this. And the problem is that in as much as you can make that comparison with big oil and these companies, they're not the same thing, because one is dealing with speech and the other deals with oil in the ground, right? So I think that's one of the things. So part of it, of Real 411, is that when we were looking in the lead up to our elections in 2019, and about 2017, we started looking and saying, well, there's a big problem here, because when you approach an election period, all of our media and our other bodies and anybody that's got anything to do with elections actually falls under our elections regulations and our election sphere. The media do certain things. They, the print media and online media agree to deal with complaints a lot faster. The broadcasters have very specific regulations that come into play. Political parties have to adhere to codes of conduct that can have criminal consequences if they don't. Government departments have to do things. So like all of the key players around the elections all had to do certain things. The big and obvious gap to that, of course, is the social media platforms, where they didn't have anything. Not only did they not have anything, they all operate, and they continue to operate on vastly different standings and understanding of what they do. So you saw that bizarre thing where last year you had a tweet that was removed by Donald Trump, that was removed from Twitter, but was allowed to remain on Facebook. And it was exactly the same kind of content. Now that you can't have in a democratic state. You can't have, okay, because it's on a different platform, it's okay there, but it's not okay here. So there was that issue about the massive gap. Then you had the issue that you're saying, well, not only is there a massive gap, they also need to be playing according to our rules. These are our elections. The entities that we all need to play according to the same level playing field. That's what a rights-based approach teaches us, right? It's meant to be about an equitable approach to these things. So we said, well, how do we start to deal with this in a way that we can hold them to the same kinds of standards, and in a way that then doesn't require some kind of legislative response that says we're going to ban this and not allow these kinds of things. Because again, in as much as you don't want to leave this in the hands of the companies, you also don't want to leave this in the hands of the states, precisely because of the negative responses we've seen globally around how most states tend to deal with this. It's not in a clever way, generally speaking, right? They tend to allow ministers or departments to make decisions on speech which are frankly very, very dangerous and more importantly, inappropriate for the state to be making. So we said, well, we need something that can allow us to deal with this, something that works with the IEC, and that was how we started to develop Real 411. And what Real 411 is essentially it's a public complaints platform that says, if you see something that you think is dodgy, that constitutes mis or disinformation, or in some of these other digital harms, you can report it to this platform. It then goes through a review process where 3 people review it initially, and then it gets reviewed by a secretariat. And at the moment, because we're in an election period, it goes, if it's about the elections, obviously, it then goes from the secretariat into the Electoral Commission's electoral justice system, and they then too review it. Now, the big thing that we've done that's quite significant. So there are a few things that are really important about this. The one is you've got a civil society body, which is the organization I represent, Media Monitoring Africa, working with the Electoral Commission in a formal partnership. That's a really good thing because it starts to build trust and credibility around the different entities. You've then also got us having a system that empowers ordinary members of the public to actually do something about disinformation, because one of the problems with reporting to the platforms is if you're an ordinary citizen, you don't know when it's going to get looked at, you don't know if it's going to get looked at, you don't know if they understand the language that you raised on occasion, Mary, the language that it's looked at in, you don't know if they're going to understand the context. There are all sorts of things, and if something goes wrong, you don't know what happens. There's no clarity on the entire process. That has got a lot better in the last few years, but it's still a bit of a black box, right? You don't know where these people are. Whereas this system, this is run within our borders. It's staffed by people that operate in South Africa, that understand our context, that understand our languages, so we can take complaints in all of the official languages and start to deal with them. So that's really significant. The second thing that we've done this year, which is a continental first, is that we've got all 4 of the big platforms to agree to actually work together with us and the IEC. Now that sounds like it should be a fairly logical thing, but actually it's a massive shift, given that, you know, South Africa is a small country in the eyes of these massive platforms. You know, we're not a massive market. We don't have, you know, that many millions and millions. You know, we're about 0.1% or 0.01%, I forget what it is now, of Facebook's kind of user base, if you take that as an example. So it's a very small market. So the fact that they're starting to see this, to recognize that if we send them something as the IEC and as part of this process of Real 411, they will look at it expeditiously. And again, we're not saying change your rules for us, but we're saying according to our rules and these issues, this is what we think. And then they need to take action on that. It then doesn't preclude the IEC, because they've got good powers anyway. They can say, well, we want the police to investigate this if they need to, if it's threatening violence or something as well, for example. Or they can say, actually, we think this is such a serious issue, we're referring it to the Electoral Court. So it puts in place a whole lot of blocks that mean that the chances of anyone using and abusing the system to limit or undermine freedom of expression in a way that isn't permissible in a rights-based framework is incredibly small. So it's a system that's now, and this is its second time we're doing it for the elections. We've been running it. It's still running now. In fact, a lot of our complaints at the moment is still about COVID mis and disinformation. But the other key thing that's really interesting for this particular discussion is that in an election period, you get heightened tensions, heightened concerns, heightened anxieties, often levels of violence, right? And one of the things that we've noticed in our work with children as well is that disinformation sadly, it doesn't, it doesn't travel on its own. It's not like you can say, okay, well, this is disinformation and this blob and that's it. Very frequently, it accompanies other kind of digital harms. If you're a female journalist, you're going to be subjected to huge amounts of disinformation, even if you're a good or a bad one, right? That's just if you're online, and as a woman generally, and if you've got opinions, you will also be subjected to abuse. Very frequently, that abuse, that harassment, is also, it has significant elements of disinformation, depending on who's deciding to go after you. If it's a troll or otherwise, they may put out certain pieces of things. They may set out an active campaign to target that person, using disinformation as one of their weapons now to kind of undermine and limit and try and shut that journalist down, try and censor that journalist. So that's why we now look at mis and disinformation. We look at incitement, we look at harassment of journalists, and we look at hate speech, because those digital harms very often kind of work together. So I'll stop there for now.
All right, thank you very much. You've actually gone into the question I was going to ask, the question I had in my head about the trends that you're seeing that are different from 2019 when you first set up this app until now in 2021 with the elections coming up next week. In terms of trends that you see, when I go to your wall, when I go to the website, I see COVID. In the word cloud, I see COVID is big there. So in terms of how you're approaching this, in terms of trends, I wonder what you're seeing, and also maybe link up the law here. What law are you looking at when you're looking at the Real Fund One? What law is informing whatever actions will be taken as a result of the complaints you receive? And what other stakeholders are you roping up in here in terms of further action when you've received certain complaints on this platform?
So again, we're not we're an NGO, so outside of this election period, because now we've got the weight and the legitimacy and the mandate of the IEC, the electoral body, behind this process to say, if we see something wrong, we can, and if we believe so, we need to, we will take action, whether it's through the police or whether it is through the electoral court or whatever other mechanisms they have available to them. And those things are defined in our Electoral Act. Specifically, there's the one that they rely on for mis and disinformation speaks about people not being allowed to disseminate false information in relation to an election. So this this comes from our early 90s approach, heading to our first elections in 1994, where there was already at that time, an active third force acting in South Africa, seeking to destabilize the country further, trying to take us and prevent democratic elections from happening. So they knew there were active people trying to put out propaganda campaigns, disseminate false information at the time. So they had it, right? It just wasn't in the way and shape and form that it is now, is so common on social media. So it was kind of built in for that particular purpose, and it's now used. So outside of that, though, we've got an MOU, almost have an MOU with the South African Human Rights Commission. They're the body that is officially mandated to deal with hate speech and some of those other elements, so that it means that if we get something like that, we share it with them. They're empowered under the Constitution to go and act, investigate. If they need to, they can have an inquiry, they can call people to account, etc. And that's been working quite well. So as a quick example, we saw in June, there was a group of people who were kind of just trying to incite. They were saying, right, we're going to meet and we're going to get rid of these foreigners because they come here, they steal our women, they rape our children, they commit all the crimes, they're all drug dealers. So it was using disinformation and Afrophobia as a campaign to try and incite people in that community to go and actually kick them out, right? So it was a clear thing of incitement mixed with disinformation and tinged with and overt racism, right? So we said, oh, this is a disaster. So we alerted the South African Human Rights Commission. We had seen this. They went into the community. They were able to have discussions with the people that were behind these things. And so when the time came for those kinds of things to happen, there wasn't the kind of massive amount of violence, etc. And as far as we're aware, no harm was caused to someone as a result of that particular event. So it's got a very nice thing of how it acted then in that instance as an early warning system to allow the appropriate body to go in, and mitigate that particular harm and mitigate that. So if you look at trends now, it's been really interesting with COVID, because as each new thing comes in, that's where you see the new trend, right? So when COVID broke, it was all about COVID doesn't exist, it's made up. And then it was like, okay, it might exist, but the way you get rid of it is you drink water, hot water, while standing upside down, or you sniff these herbs, or you eat these, you eat an ice block, you swallow that, then have a vitamin C, and then you drink boiling water as hot as you can take it, kind of like completely mad kind of answers. And then it moved into this, okay, people aren't really dying from COVID, it's all made up. And then it moved to, okay, vaccines, they're never going to work, they can't make them, it's all about bad things for Africa. And now it's about, well, now vaccines definitely are evil, they're the sign of the devil. And then you get to the 5G thing and all of those kinds of conspiracies that feed into that, to where we are now, where it's about government can't make us take a vaccine, we won't do it, this is an invasion of our rights. And you're seeing that bleeding into the elections now, where you've got some of our political parties saying, using vaccine choice, they say, as a way of, gently stating to everyone that they're actually anti-vaccine, anti-vaxxers, and people that are fundamentally opposed. So that's kind of one of the big trends. Why this, I think, is so critical is because in addition to all of the other interventions, what we have to be doing is strengthening all of the institutions of democracy. Whether they're effective or not, we have to strengthen them. So it's really critical that we strengthen the Electoral Commission. They've had a big dip in their credibility. They've been attacked in the lead up to these elections now. And the reason that matters is because if you have elections where the people don't believe the outcome, if they think that the IEC is biased and that they're going to disfavor a particular party, your whole democracy could potentially be in peril. We've seen that what happened in the States, right? I mean, there's living proof of that danger. And in a fragile democracy like ours, that's an even greater reality. So it's strengthening institutions of democracy. So you've got to work with the IEC and with the Human Rights Commission and with your academics. So we've got a lovely partnership with the University of Pretoria now and CSIR, so that we do the complaints, and then in the background they've been going around digging in, seeing where all of these accounts are going and tracking all of these things. So you're starting to get that, and that matters because you then need the media to be at the front guard, in the front of this fighting for democracy, telling people what's real and what isn't. Because if we lose those battles, or if we get undermined too far, then democracy is finished.
Thank you very much for that, William. I'll come back to you, but I want to also go to Ian to give him a chance to speak, because there's also another sort of intervention through the Disinformation Tracker, which we actually did with Global Partners Digital. You are the lead, you are, let's say, our lead researcher in this case, and you roped in a number of organizations here. Please just tell us a bit more about the Disinformation Tracker, what it does in terms of taking this legal approach into looking at disinformation, and what approaches you have seen in terms of trends in Africa and how they compare with other countries in the world. I am giving you a three-part question here. I hope you remember everything I have asked.
No problem. I hope you can hear me okay. I'll start with the first point and keep it moving from there. But I just want to thank you so much for having me today. It's really such a pleasure to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers and really address this incredibly important subject. Over the past couple of years, I've been working on disinformation and misinformation from a human rights perspective at Global Partners Digital. And really, due to the increasing trend of laws and policies criminalizing or prohibiting false or misleading information across the globe, but particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, last year in 2020, a consortium of organizations, including Global Partners Digital, the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, and others such as Article 19 West Africa, CEPESA, and Protege, we launched the Disinformation Tracker. And really, this tracker is an interactive map. It seeks to support human rights defenders in Sub-Saharan Africa by tracking and analyzing laws, policies, and other government actions, which are aimed at tackling disinformation across the region, so in a number of countries. The tracker, which is just www.disinformationtracker.org, it provides a human rights analysis of these laws and policies in 35 countries at this point. and it's based on international human rights standards on freedom of expression. It's designed to be a resource for human rights defenders, activists, journalists, researchers, or anyone else who might want to use this as a tool for their advocacy. Moving forward into the next year, we're planning on updating the tracker. And in the next few months, we're hoping that these updates and expansion will further support people on the ground in their advocacy efforts, particularly during election periods or other instances of instability or in cases of government crackdowns on civil society. Yeah, so it's an overview of the tracker. In terms of what we're seeing in terms of trends, there's a number of regulatory approaches that we're seeing in different African countries in regards to laws which target disinformation. Over the last decade, I'd say there's been a trend of governments overall across the region resorting to strict criminal restrictions on disinformation and other types of false or misleading information. And also for clarity purposes, when I say disinformation, I'm including misinformation as well as an umbrella term to distinguish. And really there's a number of ways that these appear. So some of these laws are directly linked to criminal or penal codes, which were introduced in the 1800s across Africa by various colonial systems and haven't found their way out. But in the last few years, we've seen governments introducing new types of legislative restrictive measures. So often under the guise of tackling cybercrime or protecting electoral integrity. And more recently, of course, COVID-19 has prompted some governments to pass emergency measures, which criminalize disinformation as it relates to the pandemic. And then on top of that, we've also seen laws that target disinformation specifically. In Ethiopia in 2020, there's a hate speech and disinformation proclamation, for example. And then there's laws which don't have necessarily criminal implications, but are more civil in nature or have other sorts of regulations which apply to journalists, media, broadcasters, or other types of professional associations. And then in some cases, states have adopted laws which basically grant authorities excessive discretionary powers to compel social media platforms to remove content that they themselves deem illegal, which is very problematic, of course. And really kind of failure to comply is sanctioned with significant fines, or for platforms themselves, it could be blocking. So in sum, there are really a wide range of laws and policies and really an increasing range and kind of forms of different approaches. But really they all try to do the same thing, which is to overly restrict and criminalize disinformation. And I guess the sum of that is the combined effects of these regulatory approaches, whether they're new laws or old laws, is really a further curtailing of human rights online and offline as well. The majority of these laws they're overly broad in scope. They vaguely prohibit, fake news or false information. And what this does is it gives the authorities, the police, or different government ministers really the ability to interpret them as they see fit. They often don't pursue aims that are considered legitimate under international human rights standards. And many of them contain disproportionate penalties, so extremely heavy fines or long jail sentences, or both. And they've been applied in ways that silence legitimate forms of speech. And these have consequences as well, not just for freedom of expression online, but a number of associated rights, including freedom of association and assembly. And this is obviously bad. And I suppose the irony is that when looking at elections or political processes in particular, international human rights law provides particularly strong protections to expression relating to public interest, including criticism of governments, political leaders, and to media freedom. So even false information, for example, is protected under the right to expression, of course, with exceptions. That doesn't mean that disinformation, of course, can never be restricted, but it requires a really high threshold of legality, legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality. And that's what we get into when we look at the Disinformation Tracker. And that's what this resource provides, right? It's a very detailed means for people to look at the analysis that's been undertaken and seeing where laws align or don't align with relevant standards. Yeah, so that's a pretty high level take of the tracker. That's what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa. Maricel, you also commented on other parts of the world, so I can briefly touch on that. And just say, I think there's some similarities and some differences in other countries and other regions in terms of their regulatory approaches. Obviously, information disorder, the issue of disinformation, it's a truly global phenomenon. And in the past, several years, particularly with COVID, we've seen the increasing criminalization of false information, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but in a number of places. So this is particularly prevalent in Southeast Asia. There's laws in Vietnam now, Cambodia, a new one just passed in Malaysia this past year, against the dissemination of false news, false information, fake news, whatever broad, vague term might be used and not well defined in the law itself. And in Philippines, for example, there's been dozens of arrested for fake news in 2020. They have penal code provision, which restricts that. But not just in this area as well. So there's new laws coming out of Russia and Uzbekistan and in the Middle East. In Egypt, they have a number of laws for the press and the media, and their anti-cybercrime law, for example, which restricts false information online. And again, these laws really contain kind of broadly worded offenses, disproportionate penalties, and it just kind of hands the government, a means or a mechanism of clamping down on critical voices and dissent, particularly during periods where you need to have freedom of expression recognized and supported. So during elections and democratic processes. I think one distinction maybe is we're seeing the trend develop in a couple of countries to step away from kind of content-based restrictions and kind of regulating or kind of moving away from these approaches towards new systematic ones, more broader online content regulation. So in the UK, we have the Online Safety Bill. In the EU, we have the proposed Digital Services Act. And these new responses try to tackle disinformation through broader efforts. They don't seek to criminalize the dissemination of disinformation. The UK one, for example, it tries to tackle disinformation online through introducing a duty of care, requiring certain companies to address disinformation, as well as other content that poses a foreseeable risk to physical or psychological harm to individuals, which is a bit vague itself. But definitely a different approach from what we're seeing, perhaps with these strict criminal provisions. And I guess these are perhaps more proportionate, maybe more effective. They look at transparency obligations, independent oversight, again, straying away from these content-based restrictions and looking at more processes and systems themselves. And this is, of course, something that needs to take place in conjunction with promoting independent media, digital literacy campaigns, which has been spoken about, supporting fact-checking initiatives and whatnot. So we are seeing a bit of a trend in a couple of places, but overall, not great. It's truly a global issue and specific instances and unique factors in sub-Saharan Africa. And I hope I've addressed those 3 points, Maricela, but happy to hit on anything else that you want me to.
Thank you very much for that. You've actually talked well to the criminalization of false news, increasingly not actually only in Africa, but in the world as well, but also to other positive approaches that are they're not very punitive, which you did mention and lean towards being proportionate and justified in certain contexts. And this will lead me to my next question, which is a bit potentially controversial, which I'm going to throw actually to all the panelists to get their opinion on this, because we do see this increased criminalization of false news. And I guess the popular opinion when we look at international law, for example, the Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression in Africa, as well as the guidelines, we all look, there's this call for the decriminalization of false news that we see in international law. But then now we also see certain possible scenarios. There could be a possible scenario where disinformation is spread, where we know this is deliberate false news that is designed for a particular harm. So in cases where we have disinformation and it actually leads to such an harm. So for example, it might lead, let's say, to a scenario where it actually leads to the massive loss of life of people or massive injuries to people. In this case, can we actually say, when we are calling for decriminalization of laws, can we actually say civil sanctions will be proportionate as penalties in such scenarios where disinformation has led to massive loss of life or massive injuries? I'll pose this question to all the panelists. Let me start with you, Ian, because you are the last presenter.
Yes. So, I mean, I think what we're seeing now is this increase in criminalization of, false news. They don't align with relevant standards. And we've seen in countries, in Uganda, domestic courts are kind of declaring these unconstitutional and they're overturning them. In 2016, the ECOWAS court kind of did the same thing for Gambia's law, which was against criminal offenses for sedition, false news. So I think the short answer is that advocacy in general should be targeted towards decriminalization, as these laws do in general fail to align with relevant standards. Criminal sanctions constitute really big and serious interferences with freedom of expression, and they're going to be disproportionate in almost all but perhaps the most egregious cases, as you've just alluded to. But I think there's few laws that really provide for this, and there's probably not that many instances as well that this really addresses. So I do think that advocacy should be addressed towards decriminalization. They should be, to at least at minimum, amend these laws to align with relevant standards. And I think states, should avoid content-based restrictions on disinformation, particularly through criminal laws, which, if they are at all ever used, should only be used in the most extreme circumstances where there's this, clear intention to cause a clear, widespread, objective public harm. But I think the advocacy itself can be directed towards these problematic laws to begin with, and then taking it from there. But that's a high-level take. I'm happy to have others jump in or come back to this.
Thank you for that, Ian. William, what's your opinion here?
Sorry, just struggling to find my buttons. I think I'd support broadly what Ian was saying, and certainly, so we're actually part of a working group that's been set up by our government to look at what some of the best and alternative mechanisms might be for dealing with these particular issues. We're also quite lucky to the extent that a lot of these things are kind of dealt with already in varying forms and guises, right? So we already know that if you want to, you can deal with defamation, many of the kind of crimes that are there. We've got existing laws that have been tried and tested that you can actually take action against. When our government passed a regulation in the start of COVID to outlaw certain forms of disinformation about COVID, what was really interesting was that they crafted it in a way that it had a massively high legal threshold. And when we spoke to our lawyers about challenging that, they said, look here, the thing is that in this particular context at this time, the likelihood of us losing that is not altogether unheard of in terms of it being constitutional. There's more than enough grounds, they thought, that it would be found to be constitutional by our court, given the fact that there's a pandemic. And if you lose those kinds of cases, it then sets a very, very damaging kind of precedent and can set things back quite a way back, which is why our government's approach now of saying, okay, let's sit down, let's get all the different players together, let's find out what the different ideas and mechanisms are, I think is a really, really good one, and certainly one that people should broadly welcome. It's a really important and significant thing to do. So I think the short answer for me is that these digital harms, we're going to have to find better ways of dealing with them. I don't think that we are where we need to be yet. I don't think our laws are sufficiently clear on dealing with them. Many of them are very outdated. And then, as I think Ian said, what Mary said at the start, some of them are designed to deal with like cybercrime, and they try and slip in some of these elements to deal with them there at the same time. So, it's not an easy question to answer just like that. But I think that there are going to be ways that certainly disinformation will likely be, I don't know about criminalized, but certainly actionable. Over.
Thank you very much for that. William, Sima, over to you.
I would agree that it's not useful, except in the most extreme cases, to punish individuals for disinformation. First, because it's very hard to prove someone's intent. And then secondly, punishing individuals doesn't get to the culture of sharing, which is where the harm comes when this stuff spreads all over the place. And so that's another thing. And then of course, you run a very, very high risk of infringing upon people's rights So I think because you can't prove it, it's criminalizing it is it's really difficult. I think it would be, now we're seeing that some of this comes with really big financial incentives. So people can make money off of doing this, and I mean that's where I think you have to target action, is de-incentivize engaging in this kind of behavior. I think that would be more useful than criminalizing it.
Okay, and unfortunately for a lot of context, there is already the criminalization. I see, Ian, you want to make an intervention? Please
yeah, I just wanted to add on to both those comments. I think that's absolutely right, Seema and William. Yeah, disinformation is also it's not necessarily the cause, but it's often the consequence of societal crisis and the breakdown of public trust in institutions, I'd say. When you combine, like low levels of digital and media literacy amongst the general public, and frustrations and grievances, a number of people fueled by decades of, economic deprivation, market failures, political disenfranchisement, social inequality, people are going to be more susceptible to false or misleading information. And then strategies themselves that are going to address disinformation, whether they're laws, policies, or state or multi-stakeholder efforts that we're talking about here, they're unlikely to succeed, and they're probably ripe for abuse unless we actually consider these underlying factors. So as you kind of both alluded to, I think more attention needs to be paid to these systemic issues and really how we're addressing them. But that was the only bit for me that I wanted to add, Mary Stella.
Thank you for that. And yes,
that just reminds me of what we started with in this conversation, which is that ICTs are just a tool, right? If you don't address the underlying issues that lead to this kind of behavior, whether it's through ICT or any other means, you're not going to solve the problem. So the reason that Donald Trump is appealing to the people he's appealing to is because many of those people feel ignored and left out and marginalized, and they're scared. And he plays on that. And it feels good to read stories that make you feel like what you're scared of and what you're thinking, like you're not crazy, you're right, because you see it in this story. And so unless we address those underlying issues, it's I feel like criminalization and stuff, it's futile. There'll always be another platform, there'll always be another way to do this.
That's very interesting that we are all looking into structural issues and finding more positive ways to addressing disinformation. But what we see still on the ground when we look at countries is that they are using laws. And these laws don't seem like, even though we are calling them to amend these laws, to repeal these laws, this is still not happening. And out of context, we know that these laws are being misused to silence critical voices. That is a reality in a lot of context. I see, William, you have an intervention. Please go ahead. But even as you make your intervention, yes. I actually wonder, while you make your intervention, possibly answer, now that we are in this quagmire of criminal laws, is it possible that we call for this amendment and say, if the situation arises, maybe use manslaughter, charge somebody with manslaughter? Will that be a possible charge for such a situation where disinformation actually leads to the death of somebody? Do you think manslaughter is a more acceptable charge? I'll throw this also to Ian. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess proving those things, as Seema has said, is very difficult, and that's one of the reasons why the regulation that our government's developed, you've got it's a very, very high bar to prove any of those things. So I can't see anyone really coming under the hammer for that kind of thing, but also because it's not going to stop the problem. And generally what you're wanting to do with these is get to the root cause and understand it and expose that and start to do things in different ways so that you can materially impact that, so that where you do have those instances where it results in loss of life or those things, there are existing laws that you can do that with. And this may then become, for example, an aggravating factor. So we're looking now, for example, at dealing with hate crime in South Africa, and hate crime as an aggravating factor that must be taken into account when a crime is committed. And you might do something similar like that, where you could say, in this instance, so-and-so, these and these things happened. Disinformation was clearly an aggravating factor, and that may impact something somewhere along the line. But that's not going to stop the problem. We need, far more real, meaningful action from the platforms. Until they take this stuff seriously. And we're starting to see that, they're coming under increasing pressure to actually take more action on these things. The Facebook papers being exposed, I think, is a really good thing, because it'll start to say, well, these things start to show it, the increased necessity for transparency, particularly around algorithms. But the point that I wanted to make was that one of the reasons I think many of our states, and I say our in this instance, talking about Southern Africa, is that they are ruled by old fart men who are completely out of touch with what's happening in the world. They think now along the traditional lines of, this is how we need to do these things. They don't think, how do we start to address this in a way that the world is fundamentally changed and altered? They're not getting that kind of advice. They're getting the advice that says, we're in power, we need to retain power at all costs. If that means we shut down the internet now, as we're seeing in Eswatini, we will shut down the internet. If people do this, we will go after them, we will send the police to visit them, we will assault them. It's like old school methods for how to deal with a new school problem that is just going to be consistently ahead of them, and all they're going to do is ultimately they'll make themselves irrelevant. But again, part of the most effective way of dealing with these digital harms is that we have to equally focus on all of the kind of interventions we've spoken about, but I think we need to be placing a huge amount on the importance of strengthening democratic institutions. It doesn't help that you've got a great media doing great stuff if your politicians consistently lie as a matter of course. Boris Johnson, Bolsonaro, these are scumbags who lie consistently all the time, right? Donald Trump, was the ultimate poster child of this new kind of politics, where it doesn't matter if what you say is not true, it doesn't matter if you get exposed by the media. So there has to be some fundamental shift there in terms of doing something to address those political crises that we're facing at the same time as this, because this thing isn't just in and of itself a bad idea. Over.
Thank you, William, for that. Ian, over to you.
Yeah, just to go back to your point on co-use manslaughter or for instances of hatred or violence or death. Disinformation is often used to foment hatred and violence and can result in death or something terrible like that. Just from an international legal perspective, Article 22 of the ICCPR, it provides that any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence be prohibited by law. But it doesn't actually call for criminalization. So you don't even need a criminal law itself, even on that basis. But I just want to go to the point that it may, in certain situations, provide a relevant framework for addressing disinformation. So even if using the argument of, we need criminal laws or we need to prohibit speech based on content, we already have a number of mechanisms to do that. I think advocacy should be based on aligning these laws with relevant standards. And as kind of both participants have noted here, I think we need to focus on systemic issues and we need to focus on more comprehensive means of addressing the problem. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much for that. I think we are almost done. It's almost 15:30 South African time. I think, Sima, I'll give you the opportunity to, if you want to respond to our last discussion, as well as your last words.
I don't think I have a particular response to the last comment, only to say maybe that there is currently a resolution being discussed and debated in the UN General Assembly that addresses disinformation and attempts to, make a statement about what countries and firms and the public should do. And I think, the version I saw was very weak and watered down. And I think it would be a useful exercise, like I said, to really focus this discussion in the frame of human rights and try and make international efforts that are doing that and trying to make a statement in that frame, try to do what we can to make those as strong as possible, so that then nations, regimes around the world at least have some guidance as they're trying to address it individually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any last words, or those are your last words?
Those are my last words.
Thank you very much, Sima, for being here. I really enjoyed your intervention.
Thank you.
William Bird. Final comments?
No, I mean, we're just a few days away from elections. If you see something dodgy, do something good, you know, that's report it, and away you go. Anyway, no, thanks. It's been great and lovely to listen to such fabulously exciting people. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you very much, William. Ian?
No further comments except that I'm very pleased to be on this panel. It's great to hear such fantastic perspectives, and I learned a lot, which was great. I just want to say as well that, you know, I think when it comes down to it, that this is a multi-stakeholder issue. It involves voices and contributions from all different types of actors, acknowledging, of course, the obligations that states have to uphold human rights, but also the responsibilities of platforms and also of other actors in this space to really put forward rights respecting approaches to the issue. And yeah, really happy that we're starting to be a part of that and voicing those. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the panel that we've had today. I love the discussion. I know I really love elections, talking about information disorder. And I think the panel today went far and beyond what I asked them to do. It was excellent. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Thank you for making the discussion very engaging. And thank you again for making the time to be here today.
Thank you very much, Stella, and to the university.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Before you leave, I actually have another short 10-minute discussion that I hope to engage everybody in. It comes to another theme, more on privacy, but it's something creative where we got a contribution from following our call for papers for this particular tech for Expo. We did ask several people if you're interested to bring in certain contributions of creative content to discuss issues around technology and human rights. And we did have someone, one of our contributors is called Gabriel Bangura, and he submitted a photo exhibition, which jumps to another theme, as I said, on privacy. And I'd like to share the pictures with you, and then he'll give us a bit of a background, and then I can tell everybody goodbye. So for the next 10 minutes, let us sort of engage with this picture. Let's see what discussion it brings up, and then I can let everyone go home. All right, I'm just going to share my screen right now. Gabriel Bangura, are you here?
Hi, Mary Stella.
How are you, Gabriel?
I'm good, and you?
Fine, thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself and your picture and the idea behind it so that we can start this discussion?
Yes, please. By the way, that was quite enlightening conversation I was following through. My name is Gabriel Bangura. I'm a legal communications and publications fellow at the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa. I am also a photographer, and I'm currently a master candidate at the Vienna Master of Arts in Applied Human Rights. Yes.
Thank you very much. Would you please tell us the idea behind your photograph, or would you like first for me to pose the question to all the participants? When you look at this picture, what do you see? What is the interpretation you get from this picture that Gabriel submitted?
Can't see it yet.
No, we don't see any.
Really?
Yes, it says you're sharing your screen, but it's blank. Okay, it's gone back to you.
Do you have the picture there? If the problem is my screen.
Yes, I have it, but okay. It came and then went back.
Let me try that again. You see it?
It says you're sharing again, but there's nothing on the screen.
I think I'll have to let you share. My computer has decided to act up.
Okay, if you could just allow me.
Yes, please.
You need to enable participants to share screen.
Okay, let me do that. There you go. Before Gabriel tells us the idea behind this picture, so the participants, when you look at this picture, what screams to you? What comes to your head when you look at this picture? I think I'll pick on you, William, first, because you're in media. You're always looking at media issues. Let me pick on you.
Gosh, I'm just busy looking at it. It's such a lovely, complex image. So, I mean, I guess the first thing is the extent to which she's kind of shielding her eyes, but she may not be shielding her eyes. Or even if she's trying to look away, she can't look away. She still sees through her hands, which might be in relation to the things that get said and the things that she's exposed to, that she's not very happy. You can hide these things, but you still get exposed to them. You still see them. That's what I would see as an immediate thing. As a blogger, it sounds like that might be what she's looking at. My eyes aren't good enough to read all the text on some of the other things, but yeah, that would be my initial response. Over.
Thank you very much, William. Let me pick on another of my panelists today. Sima, would you like to share with us your thoughts?
Sure. When I look at this, I just, the feeling that comes up is one of being extremely overwhelmed, where you're trying to say something and you want to be informed, but the kind of information that's at your disposal is just overwhelming. And how do you begin to say something when there are so many potential sources, potential counter arguments? It's kind of, overwhelming is what I would say.
Thank you, Sima. Ian, of course, you're my other panelist. I'll have to pick on you too. Yeah, and anyone else, feel free to jump in here.
It seems like she is working in a very complex information ecosystem, as we are all today. And I think, she's very much could be working or frustrated in a world where, independent media and journalism perhaps is not supported, and also where there's restrictive laws which may not be enabling her to enjoy her human rights online, freedom of expression, as much as she'd like to. But that's my initial thoughts there.
So interestingly, before I invite Gabriel, I need to be interested in what he thought about when he submitted this particular photograph and took and conceived this particular photograph. When I first saw it, I actually thought that, how we are addicted to social media, how we are addicted to the screen, and the fact that she was trying to cover her eyes, I thought it's because she's trying to avoid being consumed by this information ecosystem, as Ian said, but then because of the fear of missing out, FOMO, and we find ourselves, as much as we try, we are still drawn to this online space. I also thought for sure there's some reason behind the books there at the front and the computer there at the back, which Gabriel did admit. But let me invite Gabriel now to tell us the idea behind this particular photograph.
Thank you, Mary Stella.
Interpretation of it. Welcome, Gabriel.
Thank you. I must say your comments were quite insightful. So as we see in the picture, and very insightful. In fact, when I submitted this picture, Mary Stella and I had a little argument over the interpretation. So, and now everybody is giving varying interpretations of the artwork. So in the picture, as we see, it's a post photograph of a subject. This is a former colleague of mine, Agasha, and that is our library at IHRDA. Now, she's signifying an end user, a blogger, an individual behind a laptop computer with both hands covering her face. However, the paradox here is that while her face is seen to be covered by both hands, which should ordinarily obscure all identifiable features, her face, her eyes, her nose, her lips, her eyelashes, yet her face is clearly shown as though her hands were transparent. Now, this picture is representative of the online space as it is today. It represents a lot of things, but one thing I'm going to pick out for this moment is the lack of true anonymity online. So, and it also buttresses the need for the respect of privacy of end users in the internet space. It showcases this false representation of privacy, which is often used just as a mere smokescreen by tech giants to lure us, the users, us end users, to sometimes deliberately and at other times indeliberately disclose personal information about ourselves, which at the end of the day, state actors and non-state actors leverage on in violating human rights. Now, a case in point is There are a lot of digital identifiers currently in the online space. Some of these are IP address of our devices, your mobile phones, your computers, which ultimately give information about your location, our browsing activities, the sites that we frequently visit, the search towards, which are now used to send us targeted adverts when we log into social media, or not even social media, even just in the internet space, when we log out, how long we're in there for, the comments that we make, what we share when we log out, the type of devices we use. For instance, Twitter has this feature when you tweet, it tells you if it's from an iPhone, if it's from an Android, and a host of other things. Some other things such as metadata of pictures uploaded online. When you upload a picture, it can certain information about the picture's location, the people who are in the picture, are all disclosed. So what this picture is trying to portray is that while we want to keep a certain privacy, we want to keep a certain private life, the contrast between our private life and our online activities is really, really huge. So the kind of things I would rather want to keep private, oh, I'm tweeting from an Android phone. Those are certain things that I would not want anybody to know about, but then it is obviously just out there. So it really shows that there is a lot to be done in terms of human rights and in balancing the intrusion that tech has in our daily lives, which are some of the things that we are not even aware of. That is what this picture is trying to depict. There is a second picture.
Sorry, continue.
Picture. Okay, this is the second picture. So the second picture is how it ought to be. So the first picture is an abnormality. This is how it currently is, but then this is how it ought to be. Now, Maristella mentioned the books in the background. The books in the background is trying to demonstrate the difference in dispensation between the old dispensation and today's dispensation. So the old dispensation, doing research through books, getting information through books, sending information through letters, through books, which to a large extent helped us to have a certain level of privacy, which was not exposed. But now, in contrast to today's time, whatever is on the online space is apparent to not just the tech giants, but to a whole host of other intruders. So this is the abnormality, and this is how it ought to be. This is what we are fighting for as human rights advocates.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that. I think I'm just going to pick on one more person and I'll go to you. Sorry, William, but you're in media, so I have to come to you and ask you, do you now see his conceptualization of the pictures? Or do we just agree as a picture can speak 1,000 words and these words might be different for different people?
So, I mean, yeah, it does help, obviously, having the explanation. And it does give it a very different frame to it. And sorry, my video is not on. A very different frame and understanding of it, you know, and of what he's doing. The comparison of the old and the new. Maybe, you know, I assumed that they were academics or something, or lawyers. That's what their offices tend to look like in my experience of them. And maybe, you know, I'm curious as to why you've got the books still in color, but the people in black and white. You know, as to what that kind of symbolizes. And then you've got the woman above the man, which I think is an interesting kind of framing of that particular image. So I'm not sure of how that relates to the issues around privacy. But I think it's a really cool idea, though. Over.
Thank you very much, William. Gabriel, any last comments? Any response to that?
Yes, so in the first picture, we have just a lady. And in the second picture, I decided to include a lady and a man to show the gender balance. So to also say that, of course, there is certain level of gender-based violence even on the online space, but at the same time, it cuts across both genders. So this is trying to include that diversity between both genders in contrast to the first picture.
The black and white contrasts.
Sorry?
The black and white, he asked about the black and white contrasts.
Well, the black and white contrast is for aesthetic purpose
Uh-huh.
and to ensure that it is still a work in progress.
Okay, fine then. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that. And with that, it brings me to the end of our session today. And to say again, thank you. Let me reiterate my great thanks to everybody who's been able to join us today on Zoom, as well as everyone else who has joined us on our various social media platforms, as well as our website. We thank everybody who has joined us today and for the participation that you have given us. We are very grateful. Tomorrow is the last day for the Tech for Rights Expo. I hope you'll still join us for the panels, 2 panels that we have tomorrow on cybersecurity and cybercrime, as well as another one on privacy. I hope you'll be joining us tomorrow. We have an amazing lineup also set up for tomorrow. I hope you'll join us. So with that, let me say goodbye, good evening for all those who it's afternoon or evening for them. Good evening, good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mary, Stella. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.